Hello and good morning to the Redlands United Church of Christ. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be with you remotely today. My name is Craig Hadley and I am the pastor of Paradox Church on Cajon Street. Now you aren't going to believe this, but 10 years ago, I married the Kimberly Tangunen in my aunt and uncle's front yard here in Redlands. We have 2 kids, Maya, age 7, and Bodhi, age 4. This summer, Bodhi learned how to jump off the diving board completely unassisted. This past week, I asked him how he was able to jump so high, and he looked at me, dead serious, and said, "Because, Dad, I eat lots of tacos and fruit snacks." Now, my daughter Maya quit ballet about a year and a half ago because she wanted to learn how to play the drums. I have lived in Redlands for 30 of the 37 years of my life, and much like all of you, I miss the beauty, the hope, and the joy of meeting with my church family in person on a weekly basis. This picture is from our Easter sunrise service at the Appleton Ranch in 2019. Now, about 5 years ago, this wonderful group of people founded Paradox Church with the mission to see and embrace Jesus Christ in all. 2 years into our church's time together, we publicly became an open and affirming congregation of all sexual orientations and gender identities. Since that time, I officiated 2 queer weddings, and I witnessed firsthand how love wins. Now, while a handful of people from the community applauded Paradox for being progressive and forward-thinking in our theology, the fact is, Paradox was behind your church by 20 years. Y'all were open and affirming in 1998. You know what I was doing in 1998? I was graduating from the 8th grade. My friends, you are the progressive ones here in Redlands. You are the leaders in love for the city of Redlands. And you are living the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is precisely who I want to talk to you about this morning. Now, 2,000 years ago, on the other side of the planet, Jesus traveled to Jerusalem on a dusty road without much shade. On the way, Jesus stopped to tell a story in, most likely, the Aramaic language. Luke records that Jesus told this story to anyone who believed they were righteous, and that self-righteousness had led them to hold contempt for another human being. In other words, Jesus told this story for every person who has ever lived. Jesus said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, and the other, a tax collector. Now, in Jesus' day and age, a Pharisee is someone from the religious elite of society. For a modern-day parallel, imagine a Pharisee as someone with an institutional title like bishop or reverend doctor or ordained minister of the gospel. The tax collector, on the other hand, is someone who betrayed their own government, their own religion, or their own family for personal gain. For a modern-day parallel of a tax collector, imagine someone who you believe is actively working toward the destruction of this country right now. My guess is you can bring someone to mind rather quickly in today's hyper-partisan environment. So when Jesus tells a story about a Pharisee and a tax collector, everyone assumes that the Pharisee will be the hero and the tax collector will be the villain. Jesus continues, the Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all of my income." The Pharisee expresses appreciation toward God for his own spiritual enlightenment. He believes that this enlightenment is what keeps him off the streets and away from the thieves, away from the rogues, away from the adulterers, and away from the tax collectors. Because of the gratitude he feels toward God for giving him enlightenment, the Pharisee repays God with unwavering religious devotion, which the Pharisee believes fuels his own enlightenment, which keeps him off the streets, and so on and so forth. The Pharisee views religion and enlightenment as being cyclical in nature. Jesus then told of a second prayer at the temple. He says, "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.'" And with just 7 words, the tax collector's prayer comes to an end. In this story, the tax collector is a self-admitted sinner. The Pharisee is self-admitted, devoted to his religion. The sky is blue, the Pope is Catholic, and this parable is about as predictable as parables can be. But in his closing analysis of the parable, Jesus turns the entire story on its head. He says, "I tell you, the tax collector went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee." What? This conclusion that Jesus draws should give all of us pause. Remember, the tax collector is the one who you believe is actively destroying this nation. Jesus audaciously makes that person, the person that you consider to be a villain, the traitor, as the hero of this story. Jesus offers a paradoxical explanation for these inverted ethics. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. In the very next verse, Jesus gets distracted by some adorable infants, and we receive no further explanation about the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Why did Jesus make the tax collector the hero in this parable? To answer that question, let's look closely at the similarities between these two different men. Both men are practicing the same religion, at the same religious location, and participating in the same religious discipline, which is prayer. While their prayers are quite different, the subject of their prayers is the same. They are both praying about the self. For me, both men went to the temple to pray, asking the question, "Who am I?" And in this story, both men found an answer to that question in prayer. For that reason, I invite you to think about prayer in this parable as a mirror. Now, I grew up in the church and attended church school all the way until college. Over a period of decades, pastors and teachers and mentors taught me this parable at length. And all of those spiritual authorities drew the same conclusion from this parable. The reason that Jesus celebrates the tax collector as the hero is because the tax collector recognizes his sinful human nature. He then expresses his disgust with his humanity in the eyes of God. So when the tax collector asks the question, "Who am I?" in prayer, I am supposed to pray and ask the same question, "Who am I?" And religion, acting as a mirror, expects me to arrive at an answer that is this: I am a sinner. Now, religion will tell you that every human being bears this identity as a sinner because they are human. In other words, religion's application of this parable is that the true followers of God are the ones who are the most repulsed by their own humanity. My friends, this is destructive theology, and we need to stop teaching it immediately. The word gospel means good news, and the bodily incarnation of Christ is God's irrefutable declaration that it is good to be human. And if religion's foundational belief is that human beings are sinful because they are human, then that religion is literally anti-God. Christ. And when we consider that Jesus Christ is the one teaching this parable, then we can easily let go of the misinformed application that God wants us to be disgusted by our own humanity. Which brings us to the Pharisees' prayer. The Pharisee thanks God that he is not like the other sinners on the streets. And when he goes to prayer with the question, "Who am I?" prayer reflects back to him, "I have earned God's love." While this idea may sound well and good, there is a disturbing reality tied to this theology. Because if you can earn God's love, then that means that none of us are born into God's love. Receiving God's love ceases to be a gift of grace, and instead, receiving God's love becomes a position of status. This is why the Pharisee, who believes that he is enlightened, ends up hating the people around him. He earned God's love in his mind, and they did not. And if God cannot find a way to love them, then why should he waste his time learning how to love them as well? When we consider the cyclical nature of the Pharisees' religion, that God enlightened him so that he may practice religion which fuels his enlightenment, then we can see how the Pharisees' religion and prayer is an exercise in vanity. The idea that one can earn God's love will always lead toward the hatred of others. This is why Jesus condemns the Pharisee in this parable. And Jesus claims that those who find their sense of worth in religion will one day be humbled. But this is not the end of the story. Now, we do not know much about the tax collector. In his short prayer, he asks for mercy and then confesses wrongdoing. And Jesus Christ says, that man went home justified. When I consider these details, I believe that the tax collector went to the temple to ask the question, "Who am I?" He closed his eyes, his knees touched the ground, and he stared into the mirror of prayer. But rather than giving him back an answer, prayer inspired a question in him and forced him to ask himself who he was. The question that prayer reflected back to the tax collector was, how am I part of the problem? Suddenly in prayer, the tax collector felt the pain he caused in his friends and family by betraying them for his own financial gain. The tax collector looked at things from another's perspective and realized that he was part of a system that was taxing the poor to line the pockets of the rich. The tax collector saw himself taking from those who were in need, and he questioned the very basis of his work. And rather than get up from his prayer and go back to his life as normal, the tax collector realized that he was part of the problem. He cried out, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner," because he knew that he deserved to be punished for the heartache that he caused. Now, we do not know the rest of this parable, but I assume that the tax collector made some serious changes in his life going forward. And all of those changes began in a moment of prayer, when prayer turned back on him and dared him to ask, how am I part of the problem? Now, this question may sound similar to religion wanting people to realize that their humanity is inherently sinful. But the difference for me is that religion's claim leads to lower self-esteem and bitterness, while this question leads to deeper contemplation and opens one's soul to transformation. All of us have experienced healthy and unhealthy religion. For me, this is the question that separates healthy religion from unhealthy religion. We are called to avoid the Pharisees' temptation of vanity in religion. Instead, we are called to embrace humility that asks us to be the ones who are willing to change. How am I part of the problem? is a prayer of transformation that leads toward healthy spirituality. And this prayer and this parable remind me of one of the greatest pieces of literature penned in American history, the letter from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. In 1963, Dr. King described the city of Birmingham, Alabama, as, quote, probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States, close quote. He, along with several other Black Americans and allies, participated in nonviolent direct action to protest the city's commitment to white supremacy. This challenge was not well received by the white people of Birmingham, and white police officers arrested the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and threw him in jail. The very next morning, 8 white Christian pastors came together and released a unity statement denouncing MLK and all of his supporters. Note, these 8 white Christian pastors did not come together in a statement of unity and denounce white supremacy. Instead, they denounced Dr. King. They condemned him for agitating locals and not working with due processes of law to inspire change. Now, Dr. King was enraged by the show of unity from these white pastors. From his cell, on scraps of paper, he responded to these white pastors' criticisms with a letter. And 57 years ago, he wrote these words in a cell. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. My friends, please take a moment and understand the gravity of Dr. King's words. In this letter, he testifies that the worst kind of white Christian is not the white Christian that burns crosses. Instead, the worst kind of white Christian for Dr. King is the one who gazes into the mirror and comes away with the conclusion, I am not a racist. According to Martin Luther King Jr., in 1963, this is the worst kind of white Christian. And to my white sisters, my white friends, and my white brothers who are listening to this day, I don't know about you, but the events of the past 4 years have inspired a lot of soul searching in my prayer life. And when we go to prayer, to contemplate who we are, and the conclusion we come away with is, whew, thank God I'm not a racist, then do you know who we sound like? We sound exactly like the Pharisee praying at the temple, and nothing changes. Nothing changes because we view racism and white supremacy as someone else's problem when we say the words, I'm not a racist. Friends, the world does not need any more white Christians who say, I'm not a racist. Because what the world hears is, this isn't my problem. But both Christ and Dr. King call us back to humility. What the world needs are Christians who are courageous enough to look into the mirror with the discrimination and segregation raging around us and offer the tax collector's prayer. We need Christians who are willing to ask, how am I part of the problem? May the tax collector's prayer open our hearts to transformation. May the tax collector's prayer expose the privileges we benefit from. And may our faith inspire us toward beauty. And may we work boldly against racism, against sexism, against homophobia, and against hate. And may we work together toward greater empathy, greater equality, greater justice, and greater love. Amen.